The convergence of telecommunications and broadcasting began 15 or 20 years ago. Look at how the communications marketplace has changed. The Broadcasting Services Act of 1992 revolutionized media law. In that year, the first SMS message was sent, and according to the sci-fi film 2001: A Space Odyssey, the fictional HAL 9000 computer became operational and threw down a challenge to we humans. Immediately after that, the next year, in 1993, Mosaic, the first web browser, was released by the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois, the NCSA. And around that time, in 1994, Yahoo started up, yet another hierarchical officious oracle, Yahoo, and Netscape was founded. Sony introduced the PlayStation video game console. 20 years after the Broadcasting Services Act, ABS statistics show that today data use is growing at over 20% a year. Internet traffic is now 11 times the level in 2005, with compound growth now projected at about 50% a year and consumer growth greater than business. The nation is engaged in a process of reform which is transforming communications and media in Australia. There are three parts to the reform. First, Australia is building a high-speed optical fibre network with entry-level services at 12 megabits per second at a uniform price to every home and premises in the country. It's replacing the copper wire telephone service. The second element is that Telstra, the dominant telco, is structurally separated from the copper wire network. Third is the report of the Convergence review. It is really about content. New technologies and business structures are only about the plumbing. The content flowing through the pipes is the real object and purpose of the reforms. The Convergence review is responding to new consumer demand for content when we have reached a point when there is no limit to content services. Legal and regulatory settings for communication of content form part of the framework for an information society, and these settings, if we get them right, are infrastructure for building a sustainable knowledge economy. It is social infrastructure. This independent Convergence review and the report are world-leading responses to address transformative changes in the flow of information and creative expression, which are the lifeblood of our culture. Consumers now personalize their news and their screen viewing, search for and get access to any content, and they create, produce, and distribute their own content globally. Citizens are accessing e-health, e-government, and e-education services daily on internet-connected screens in the home, on tablets, and on smartphones. Now, after extensive consultations, 340 written submissions, 28,000 comments, publishing 7 consultation papers and an interim report, the Convergence Review report has proposed regulatory structures for these new services and the new ways consumers are using them. In a global network communications environment, I do not believe that it is possible for government to pass legislation that can possibly keep pace with the accelerating change in information and communications technologies, new services, and new demand in the fields of communications and media, and for that matter, classification, copyright, and cybersecurity. Flexible and adaptable principles-based regulation that supports a vibrant and competitive market is the only way to protect and maintain the public interest in such a dynamic environment. The digitization of information and the connection of things to the internet have brought us to an information revolution. This revolution will have as great an effect on us as the industrial revolutions of 1820 and 1920 had on the lives of our forebears. We are still only at the beginning of this great structural shift in our society and commerce. The Convergence Review proposes measured and coherent answers to a great question of our times. Will we manage the technology, or will the technology manage us? The answers to this question will drive the digital transition in our economy and shape our society. Throughout his career, Glen Boreham, who's starting the discussion for answering these questions with his team, has led organisations in the information technology, new media and creative industries through periods of rapid change and innovation. Previously, Glen was Managing Director of IBM, Australia and New Zealand, and now engages in a portfolio of activities, including roles as Chair of Screen Australia and Non-Executive Director of Data3, an award-winning IT company. His most recent contribution as the Chair of the Australian Government's Convergence Review is the subject of this address. Please join me in welcoming Glen to the stage.
Thank you to Professor Bill Purcell and to Professor Michael Fraser for your welcome, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here at UTS tonight. I'm very regularly part of the audience for these Spotlight events, so when I was asked as to whether I could do a Convergence Review speech, it was a great honour. This is actually my only second set-piece speech since the release of the review. We've done a lot of media, Louise and Malcolm and I, but this is only the second speech, and it was wonderful that I could do it in this institution. I think the UTS today is a wonderful institution, but it is only going into better places, and I'm very pleased to have the roles that I have with this place. I'd also, Bill mentioned, but I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of my colleague on the Convergence Review Committee, Louise McElvogue. The Convergence Review Committee was only 3 people, Louise, myself and Malcolm Long. It was a team effort. Malcolm would actually have been here himself tonight, but he was sensible enough to take some well-earned holiday post the Convergence Review. But Louise is here and will join me on stage for the Q&A. I expect the fact that you're here on a wet, cold Wednesday night when there is also another event in Sydney out at Homebush this evening indicates that you probably haven't just sort of roamed in off the street, and you're here as an educated audience, understanding the topic and wanting to learn more. So in that context, though, I will start at ground zero and talk about what is convergence, and I'll pick up some of the themes from Michael Fraser. And then, is there an issue? Again, some of the remarks that he's teed up. And then, what is a convergence review? I should start by saying when we first come together as a team, we thought the Convergence Review was an awful title, particularly the fact that we were travelling around Australia and putting advertisements in newspapers and asking members of the public to come and tell us what you think about the Convergence Review. And we considered changing it, but as I pointed out to my colleagues early on, in government reviews there was the Henry Review into taxation, there was the Gonski Review into education, but the Boreham Review into the media probably wasn't the image or the kind of vibe that either the government or the industry wanted. So we stuck to the Convergence Review, and apologies to my father and his ancestors. So let me get started. So what is convergence? Now, I explain it at a very practical level, talking about what happened in my own home over the last decade or so. And the way I used to access the media was fixed and it was dedicated. You had the television in the lounge room, you had the radio on the mantelpiece, you had the phone on the kitchen bench, and the newspaper was delivered was with a physical thud on the veranda, or if you're old enough to remember paper boys, which is my first job, actually people wandering around the streets and selling papers. And the way our media was delivered to us and the way it was organised was all very neat, it was all very distinct, and it was all very clear. Now, fast forward to today, and we have this phenomenon of media convergence. And today on a single device, probably the most representative device is an iPad or an Android tablet. But on a single device, I can watch video, I can listen to radio, I can read a newspaper, I can communicate with family, friends and business associates, and I can do that mobile, virtually from anywhere. Now, this at the core is what convergence is about. For those who've spent a career in IT like I have, it's nothing new. This has been happening for 30 years, but it has really taken hold in the media in recent times. It's about any to any, almost any content to almost any device. Now, it's important as we get into some of the dense material about regulation and rules and everything else to state very clearly up front that convergence of the media is an absolutely wonderful thing. It's provided all of us as consumers with new range of services, new conveniences that we've never had before, and it's provided both threats but significant opportunity to the industry to adapt to a new landscape. It is something to be embraced, and it is something to be celebrated. Given the wonderful benefits that Convergence Review is bringing, it leads to the question, well, is there a problem? And what is the issue? And why did the Australian government commission a Convergence Review? Now, I will talk tonight about a wide range of very specific point issues, but what I've tried to do in this chart is to really summarise a very complex set of different issues into a single picture. On the left of this chart is the way that the industry was structured in 2000, with the vast majority of our media being delivered by traditional means. And by that I mean over the airwaves broadcasts of TV and radio, some cable television delivered to us, and newspapers delivered, as the name implies, by paper. Now, given the way things looked, not surprisingly, the government defined and regulated the media by the way it happened to deliver its content, rather than the content itself. There were specific acts of parliament, Michael's covered some of these, but perhaps the most representative is the Broadcasting Services Act of 1992, started when it was legislated at less than 200 pages, and is today over 1,000 pages. As those rules of those laws have been stretched trying to keep up with technical change and innovation that the original drafters of those laws could never forecast. Now, fast forward to 2020, the year 2020, as represented on the right of the chart, and the world has been turned on its head. And I read recently that the respected media executive, Harold Mitchell, is saying by 2020, 85% of our media will be delivered digitally. Now, nobody knows whether that's precisely right or not, but I think we can all recognise that it is directionally correct. So simply put, if you look at those two pie charts, this means without change, much of our media would miss the existing regulatory net. The rules that we have in place today will be ineffective, often unenforceable, and for those still in the traditional space, in that small slice of the pie on the right-hand side, these will become increasingly unequal and increasingly unfair. A practical example I can give you from this theory is with television. Free-to-air television in Australia today has significant regulatory obligations regarding Australian content, local content, community standards, etc. Yet a new entrant could come into our market, could come into Australia and deliver a service that for all intents and purposes is identical to a Channel 7, 9 or 10. And just because of the fact they happen to deliver that service via the internet, which is now plentiful, they miss the regulatory net. So when you sort of weigh all this up, there are really simply, through a very complex set of point issues, there are really simply two broad options. One is you abolish all existing regulation and just drop the barriers down completely, or if there is going to be regulation, you clearly need to change the way it's applied. So what did the review do? And I won't go through, this one is working, which is good. I won't go through all our activities in detail. You can read the chart. But we met with the major media companies right up front. They were very engaged at a chief executive level. We met with the industry associations, those representing the commercial free-to-air television lobby, independent producers. We met with community organisations, like those representing children's interests. As has been alluded to, we toured Australia. We went to all the capital cities. We went out to places like Alice Springs and Ballarat to understand that things are different from Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane out in the regional centres. We took detailed submissions of some 2,700 pages. So for those of you old enough, it's about 4 good-sized telephone books. And we returned serve on that amount of paper by producing a whole series of papers and reports of our own, culminating in the final report. But crucially, we were asked by the Minister, Stephen Conroy is the relevant Minister, we were asked by the Minister to consider the reports of the National Classification Review that was going on, and then also consider the findings of the Independent Media Inquiry. Now, for those of you who have followed this, it is fair to say that the Independent Media Inquiry come to the Convergence Review out of left field. Journalistic standards for the print press was not central to our original brief, but both the government and then us in the review had to deal with what was playing out in the UK with the News of the World scandal and everything else, and determine what an Australian response would be. And certainly, of all of the things we've recommended, the piece that covers standards of the print press, regulation of the print press, has dominated a lot of the commentary that followed the release of our report, and I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But there was one very distinct and important finding from our consultations, and that is there are two very different and very clear constituencies in this debate, both important, both relevant, but different. The first was the media industry itself, that was understandably pushing for less regulation, less cost, more freedom to operate, addressing a lot of the crucial issues of the industry with an organised and forceful voice. I understand all that. I've run large companies in Australia. I understand that you would like government out of the way as much as possible, and you would like less cost burden and more freedom to operate. Very understandable. But the second group was the Australian public. And understandably, they weren't so concerned about the internal running of media companies, about licence fees or trigger events or tax rebates or compliance costs. But they had a different focus, a focus equally important, and I'll talk about the outcomes that the Australian public told us were important to them on this very next chart. So we started with the premise of why regulate at all. As has been described in my background, I had 25 years with IBM, one of the global success stories of international capitalism. I'm not a regulator by training. I'm not a regulator by instinct. I'm a commercial business person by training and instinct. So in that sense, we started with a deregulatory stance, and our first port of call was in this spider web of regulation that does exist today, what could be abolished. And I'll list some of the rules that we recommend to remove and abolish during the course of this speech. But the put your marker down decision for us, both real and symbolic, was the abolition of the need for Australians to have a broadcast licence. So the concept today and historically has been that the government limits broadcasting, that there is a government authority that issues licences. It issues licences by broadcast type, it issues licences by licence area. And this came from an era of scarcity. It came from an era when there was only so much radio frequency spectrum available, and the government licensed it out bit by bit and took all sorts of interests into account. Of course, today, in an era of content distribution enabled by high-speed internet, we've gone from scarcity to plenty. But after starting on a deregulatory footing, we found that there were three enduring priorities. That convergence had changed a lot, but not these three imperatives. And they were the diversity of media ownership at the heart of a healthy democracy. They were minimum content standards, so we expect to protect our children, at the most obvious example, from inappropriate content in the media, and the support for Australian content, stories of social and cultural significance to us. I'll speak to each of these because these really underpin everything we did, but I'll speak to each of these in some detail. So then we thought, well, okay, why regulate at all? There are these three priorities, but who should be regulated? And the first two bullets on this chart were very fundamental to our final recommendations. The first was undoubtedly convergence had dramatically changed how we access media. I talked about an iPad as example earlier, but it's more than just a device. For example, I've no doubt that the UTS students that are here tonight are probably members of UTS student interest groups on Facebook or Twitter or wherever else. Now, somebody coming out of tonight or in a classroom tomorrow might post something on Facebook saying, hey, I've just read this, take a look at it, and there it is. But when you click that link, despite the fact it's being distributed via new and innovative ways, when you click that link, if the source is professional media, the originator is still overwhelmingly Australian. It is still overwhelmingly the large trusted brands, and the link will take you to an article on the Sydney Morning Herald website or to the ABC Online or to a video clip on Channel 10. So how we access media, professional media, has changed dramatically. But where it originates from has changed far less so, which was a fundamental finding of our review. So with that, we recommended a concept called Content Service Enterprise. Very clunky name, but it was a new and clear way for us of deciding who should be subject to regulation. And it was across three broad areas. One, it's professional and controlled content only. So we took a decision that some will applaud, some will think is controversial, but we took a decision to say we're excluding user-generated content and social media. It is what we would generally recognise, and there'll be grey areas, we might get some questions on that, but it is professional media. We said that based on the fact people are still going to the large brands, it's based on scale, which is simply Australian audience and Australian revenue, and it's based on scope, simply meaning if you don't do news, you don't have news standards obligations. If you don't do Australian content, nor do you have Australian content obligations. And we then took all that in, and in our report recommended some very high thresholds. So what we said was based on if the thresholds that we recommended in our report were implemented, it would include today, subject to these regulations, only the 15 most substantial media organisations in Australia. It's sort of a 90-10 rule. If you do it to that, you cover the vast majority, and then the compliance and obligations costs and everything once you get below the line start to become ineffective. But the key point, and really what underpins everything we did, and Michael commented on this, was a really principled shift to what you do, to the content, rather than how you just happen to deliver it. That certainly from a consumer's perspective, I don't care. I don't care whether my television comes down the cable versus over the air versus any other means. It is the content that's important. So then the next thing after who should be regulated was who regulates. And we recommended two distinct bodies. And this is one of the things that I wanted an opportunity to explain, because it was one of the most, in the commentary post the report, it was one of the things that I think was most misunderstood. The first body is a statutory authority, it's a government authority, and it's effectively a replacement for the current regulator, the ACMA. Now, this recommendation should in no way be seen as a criticism of the ACMA or its people. In fact, some of the most valuable contributions we got to our study were from the ACMA. But the ACMA itself acknowledged the challenges it faced in being given an effective toolkit. When the ACMA was formed, it was formed through a merger of two bodies, the ABA and the ACA, we love acronyms, and it wasn't given an effective toolkit. And the ACMA pointed this out, which helped our findings with a paper called The Broken Concepts last year. But we've taken our recommendations one step further than I think an existing government statutory authority can do. It is a little hard when you're sitting there as the authority to be critical of those above you or want to change the structure of those above you. And what we've done is proposed a fundamentally different model, one where the regulator is truly at arm's length to government. Today, a lot of media regulation is subject to direct ministerial direction. Today, it is prescribed in deep black letter law, lots of rules, and we've said that the government should set strong principles, the government should set frameworks, the government should have oversight. Ultimately, the government is responsible, but it is an independent regulator that interprets these and then implements them in an ever-changing world. And some people have said, well, how can you do that? Can you ever have such a body, such an independent regulator? And I say, think of the Reserve Bank of Australia or the ACCC. Truly never accused of political bias, never accused of not operating anything but independently. And I think the media is an important enough industry to have an independent regulator of that status and of that strength. Then, in addition to the government regulator, we're proposing a separate and equal body, one that is industry-led to self-regulate news and commentary. This was a matter within which we faced a very stark choice. We concluded that you can no longer justify print news to be different to radio and television news, which is the way it is today. Print news is self-regulated, radio and television news is government regulated. Now, the fact is, in a converged world, it is often the same journalist. It's a Laurie Oakes or a David Spears or an Annabelle Crabb saying something in a broadcast sense over the television and then repeating that same day in a newspaper article, yet they're regulated fundamentally differently. And the distinctions between what is a newspaper and what is a television station are blurring. If I go onto the Sydney Morning Herald website, there's a print article, of course, it's a newspaper, but invariably there's a video clip attached above it. If I go today to the Sky News website, they've got their video coverage, but there's a print article attached to it. The lines of convergence, the blurring is a result of this convergence. So if you accept that, which I think is inarguable, how do you bring it together? And it was clear. You either move print news regulation from the industry across to the government in line with TV and radio, or you move TV and radio news from the government to the industry. And in the sense of what I said setting this up, we started with a deregulatory bias. We recommended the latter, a deregulatory move, shifting all news and commentary standards to a new industry body. And I'll talk a little bit about the industry body in another chart. So now I'll touch on each of these three areas that we found were crucial to our findings and crucial to the Australian media landscape. The first is media ownership. I think most people intuitively get that the diversity of opinion, particularly news and opinion, news and commentary, not so much children's or other things, but the diversity of news is at the heart of a healthy democracy. You want people on both sides of the arguments, both sides of the political fence represented. And we concluded that diverse ownership continues to be a mechanism that underpins that. Now, there was an argument put to us that diversity restrictions should just be completely abandoned. They are no longer relevant because in the internet world, everything has become democratised, and I guess in effect, if one person consolidated and owned all of the media in Australia, it actually didn't matter anymore because we could go out and Google anything else we wanted to find. But that argument didn't fit with the reality that Australians still go to the large trusted media brands for their news and commentary. And we believe, even if it was an insurance policy, and I don't believe it's an insurance policy, I actually believe it's a mandatory, but even as an insurance policy, having media owned by multiple entities remained an important safeguard. So we recommended that there's an existing numerical number of voices rules. It's currently called the 4-5 rule, and I won't bore you with the detail, but just give me an example. This rule states that there are a series of local markets throughout our nation. Let's take Sydney the Sydney region as a local market. And it today says there must be 5 distinct voices in the Sydney media landscape. We actually said the word voices was overly cute because it actually really means owners rather than voices, and that this rule should be updated to acknowledge the contemporary media landscape. Some of you may be surprised, for example, that in this voices rule, things like national newspapers or subscription television are not counted as voices today. It's like The Australian or Foxtel are not voices in our Sydney market. They don't count. So we propose this rule simply be updated, reflecting the full topology of voices in our media, in the modern media. And then, and this is one of the things that is controversial in our report, I think, on a very limited basis, we propose the introduction of a public interest test for major mergers and acquisitions at a national level. This is only subject to the top 15 companies and only within the top 15 those that genuinely operate nationally. The public interest test, I think, addresses 2 flaws in the current system. The first is that there are no national specific media laws. As I've said, everything today is based on local areas that 20 years ago was fine, but in an era today where every piece of media is available nationally via the internet, is redundant. And then the second is the role of the ACCC, the role that they have today in blocking mergers or approving mergers and acquisitions. The ACCC's brief is a dry market analysis as to whether competition has been reduced. We met with Graham Samuels when he was leading the ACCC very early on, and he openly acknowledged this, as they did in their written submission to us. And it has long been recognised that competition issues and diversity issues in the media are related but different issues, and that a public interest test could consider non-economic considerations. At an extreme, to make my point, a merger may pass the ACCC competition rule because it's not deemed to be reducing competition in a market, but that change of ownership could effectively trash the range of services available to Australians nationally. So it's not reducing competition, but it is diminishing services, and that's okay. And that is the sort of issue we think should be addressed by a public interest test. The second area is content standards. I've covered some of this in Who Regulates, but the first point is Australians do expect some minimum content standards in our media. Protection of children, as I've mentioned. They want to have a classification scheme that informs us as consumers, and they want to have a reason to feel confident that there's accuracy in our news. So a key point is that this new statutory regulator will house a new single all media classification board covering all platforms. Now, this was a recommendation of the concurrent classification review led by Professor Terry Flew. We've taken it and embraced it. But in my view, this is simply common sense. Some of you may be surprised to know today that a piece of content is classified differently depending on the platform with which you watch it. So, for example, a movie shown in a theatre is classified differently to that same movie shown on television to the same movie shown on the internet. It doesn't make any sense. Do it once. Our needs as consumers shouldn't change. It'll simplify the system. The second point is regarding the industry-led news standards body. We've said that the major news enterprises must be members of this body. It is different to the topology that exists today. We've said the industry can self-regulate, it can be the master of its own destiny, it can avoid perceived political influence from statutory regulation, but you must play in your own scheme. If you are part of a regulatory scheme such as this, you're always going to face a time as a member when you don't agree with the finding. That's the nature of, that's what this organisation does. It issues findings to say you need to tidy this up because you've done something that is not correct. That's the nature of the beast. And what has occurred in the past is if a member has had an adjudication or two they didn't agree with, they've been able to say, despite joining this body, despite agreeing with the rules and the sanctions, you know what, I'm leaving. And I'm leaving immediately. And by the way, I'm actually going to damage you on my way out because I'm going to take my funding with me. So there's been a punitive measure over the body, which today is the Australian Press Council. And now that has happened a number of times in recent history. So we've said you can self-regulate, but if you're one of the top 15 enterprises in the Australian media and you do news, which all of them would, you have to be a member of your own scheme. And then finally on content standards, we put forward two recommendations. One was that this new news body, one was that this new news body, let me just go back, could seek limited government funding. And this was a proposal put to us by the Press Council itself that said, look, there may be situations, a real life very good example was that if the existing Press Council takes on TV and radio news, that is a very significant shift and upscaling from where it is today. The news body may say, hey, there's a whole lot of one-off costs that we're going to bear as a result of that. Education, training, rebuilding our organisation. It is unfair that our members bear that cost because it's in the national interest to do this properly, and they may be able to apply to the government and say, doing this properly is in the national interest, we'd like to seek some funding. We've said the funding should ever only be minority funding, it should be primarily funded by the industry, but that option should exist. The second matter was, it was put to us that if there was a new industry body, you could contemplate a situation where they had exhausted everything they could possibly do to bring a recalcitrant member into the fold. So they'd used all their sanctions, all their codes, all their powers and said, this organisation that continuously breaks our rules is making us all look bad. It's making our industry look bad. And in that case, there would be the option to refer that member to a statutory body, to the government. Now, some people have come out and said these are bad options, and this is a healthy debate. One is that once there's any government funding in an independent industry body, that body is compromised if it's $1. And the other is that any power to refer from the industry to a statutory authority is statutory regulation via the back door. But the crucial point that's been missed in some of the debate that's been had post the review is that these matters are decisions for the industry. They are not decisions for government. We've provided the options that the existing industry body actually asked for, but the new industry body regulating news will come together. It will set its codes, it will set its sanctions, it will set its rules, and it would be reasonably legitimate for that body to say, we are explicitly ruling out government funding, or we are ruling out referring to government, or they could do the other. They can say, on balance, we think that it's valuable. The third area is Australian content. Now, the support for Australian content has been a bipartisan and continuous feature of the Australian media for over 50 years, and it's widely recognised that a market failure exists for the production and distribution of Australian content. Now, what do I mean by a market failure? Simply put, to make a quality Australian TV drama, think of The Slap or Underbelly or Packed to the Rafters, that costs in the vicinity of $1.5 million an hour to make locally, versus buying a high quality overseas program where its investment and profit have been recouped in an international market. Think of something like anything in the CSI detective genre. That might cost $200K an hour. So you've got $200,000 an hour for overseas content, $1.5 million an hour for Australian content. Now, the cold hard fact is that if I'm the chairman of a company, if I'm chairman of channels 7, 9 and 10, and my objective, which it is in those cases, is to maximise profit to my shareholders, I would of course opt for the less expensive product with a much greater profit margin. But we thought we should test this argument out, and it was mentioned when my bio was read, I'm the chairman of Screen Australia, so I actually do have some interest in this, and I thought, well, you know, maybe the pro-Australian content lobby is believing its own propaganda. So we decided to get the team for PwC, a very respected group of people who do the annual media and entertainment outlook for PwC. We commissioned them to take a look at what would happen to Australian content if the existing rules were taken away. And the PwC findings were frightening. It said that zero Australian children's television would be made without the government support that exists today. Documentary production would halve. And then the piece that actually surprised me was the adult drama piece, because when you think of commercial television in Australia, you think of, you know, Underbelly being at the core of Channel 9's brand and franchise, Packed to the Rafters with Channel 7, etc. But what it told us was that adult drama would actually drop by 90% without government support. There's no market failure for Australian sport and news. That has a natural protection of being benefit of inherently local and best live. But in those three areas that we called the endangered species, the drops would be dramatic. So with that in mind, we said, well, how effective will the existing rules be in the longer term? And we concluded that what is there today, which is a fairly blunt hours of production quota. So if you're Channel 7, 9 and 10 today, between 6 AM and midnight, you have to show 55% Australian content. That's the bluntest instrument to get Australian content on our screens. Now, that concept of just a quota was fine in a one-dimensional linear world. Where there was only 7, 9 and 10, they put 55% Australian content out, and the only option we had was to absorb 55% of it. Of course, that's no longer the case with subscription TV, increasingly media on demand. So we thought that had to change over time, and what was there will become ineffective over time. So we suggested recommending what we called a uniform content scheme that says we don't care how you deliver your product, whether it's via the airwaves or via the internet or whatever else. If you meet very high thresholds for professional video content, again measured by revenue and audience, you must invest specifically in the Australian content endangered species. We estimated it to be about 3 to 4% of Australian revenue, and again it's a very high bar. But one of the barriers we hit in this discussion was that this will take time to implement because it will require a reopening of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And we were assured, the advice we got was it could be done. It is a reasonable request, but given that this needs to open an international trade agreement, it may take some time. So we recommended some transitional arrangements. The first was, during transition, maintain the 55% quota with the fear that the Australian production industry would collapse. Commercial free-to-air television remains the dominant form of screen content that we access. The long talked about death of free-to-air television ain't happening. Viewers of free-to-air television increased 14% in the last year. We said target an increase to those endangered species, and I'll discuss these in my final chart. Give the networks flexibility they sought and deserve in meeting their Australian content obligations across their 3 channels, and offset this increase by also increasing the tax break they get from 20% to 40%, and extend pay TV's obligations to include Australian children's and documentaries, where today they only have drama. It has to be said, it was put to us that we could have reasonably doubled subscriptions TV's requirements from 10 to 20%. Apparently, that was the intent when the legislation was first drafted, but it was decided as a compromise while the pay TV industry matured to halve it to 10, but we said we didn't recommend that. And the other thing was, when the free trade agreement was first contemplated, it did allow for a 55% quota to be put on a second channel of a commercial television network. But again, we thought that effectively doubling the requirements to the free-to-air networks by putting that 55% quota or the 10 to 20% for subscription was over the top. Just some other matters quickly. So Spectrum, today broadcast licences for major operators come with Spectrum included, so it's a single licence. You're licensed to put something out, and the delivery mechanism being Spectrum for which it's delivered. We said break that connection to allow broadcasters to deliver any way they wish. Move from an arbitrary tax on gross earnings, which is the way broadcast licence fees are largely collected today, to market-based pricing with a security of tenure for existing holders. Something that was missed, I think, in a lot of the commentary was what I believe to be something that will have significant ramifications, and that is give existing Spectrum holders the ability to trade Spectrum. So as compression technology increases the number of channels that existing rights holders can produce, they could trade some of it. They could say, we've got 3 channels today, we don't need any more, I'll on-sell some of my capacity. And then open the spare Spectrum, not available, that has been held for a full 4th commercial network, hold that over for innovative individual channels. And then in regard, I know we've got some people from both the SBS and ABC here tonight, in regard to the public broadcasters, we said, update the charters to reflect their contemporary activities. For example, it was put to us that there is nothing in the ABC charter that, if my memory serves me correct, was put in place in 1983. There is nothing in the ABC charter that explicitly gives it permission to be online. Not surprising when it was put in place in 1983, but it was put to us that therefore the ABC shouldn't be online. So we've said contemporise their charter. And then the other thing that we learned in the process, which was interesting, was that while the government says to the commercial sector you have to show 55% Australian content, they never did that. It was, I guess, implied to the public broadcasters. So we said, as a matter of principle, if you're going to ask the commercial sector to do it, it seems reasonable to ask the public sector to do it, that the ABC should have a 55% quota on its main channel, and that should be applied at half the rate for the SBS, acknowledging that the SBS's inherent multicultural remit requires more overseas programming than the other stations. Second last chart, now let me make sure I got it the right way around this time. And this is the opportunity that I'm pleased to have, I guess, to set the record straight on a number of matters. The first is, we got off to an interesting start with the Convergence review on press coverage. A few days before the final report was released, a front page exclusive appeared on the front of the Australian newspaper, and it said that we were recommending a retired judge with the ability to impose fines on the print press. Unfortunately, I get it. It was a journalist trying to get a jump and get a front page article, but unfortunately it was just completely and horribly wrong. And as I pointed out, I think we might have some of the Australian here tonight, but as I pointed out to the Australian, the report is 198 pages and the word fines doesn't appear once in 198 pages. So it wasn't kind of a bit wrong, it was completely wrong. And then based on that, and based on the fact that the independent media inquiry had recommended statutory regulations, sections of the press seemed to get a bit of a roll on. They said that the government has power to direct the news standards body. No, it hasn't. The government regulator sits above the self-regulatory news body. No, it doesn't. And as Louise and I said, it kind of felt a bit like Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. We wrote the report, we knew what was in it, but we were thinking maybe if you play it backwards or you read it upside down, there's actually stuff in there that we didn't say, and it just gives me a chance to clarify that. The second was the creation of a super regulator, was some of the headlines in the press. If super means streamlined, better rules, more effective, we agree. But the connotation of super was an expanded, big brother, intrusive government approach. And you simply can't get that from the report that states on page 2 of the report that the new regulator should be smaller, I quote, and that abolishing the work it does today, like the administering of broadcast licences, and moving other work to the industry, like news and commentary standards, will result in a smaller and more streamlined regulator, not a super big brother, all-encompassing regulator. The other was that we let the internet players off the hook. Now, what the evidence told us, and you should never let the evidence get in the way of a good old argument, but what the evidence told us was if you exclude user-generated content, that professional media content coming from the internet players, think of YouTube or Apple TV or Big Pond TV or Fetch, is still surprisingly a long way from the major established players, and there's statistics to support that in the report. So we created a framework, but in case anyone thinks we just ignored the internet players, let me quote. If a new internet delivered service grew revenue at audience comparable with today's TV broadcasters, it would have like obligations. It's about what you do rather than how you deliver it. You can't regulate, the next one, you can't regulate in an internet-enabled world. This is bigger than Convergence Review. The logic behind this is that the internet has done away with national borders, the barriers are down, there's nothing national governments in the world can do, and I fundamentally disagree with that, and I think it's an issue of national sovereignty. I worked in IBM for 25 years. That company did business in 170 countries around the world, and we complied with national laws in each and every one of them. We complied with industrial relations, complex tax laws, local advertising rules. The global banks operate in an environment where there are very unique and distinct local financial services market rules and regulations in each environment. You can do it. The internet is harder. I'm not for a minute saying it is as simple as the physical world. It's harder. We need to be thoughtful. But the sort of basic idea, if you take it to the extreme, that a country like Australia just shrugs its shoulders and gives up and says there is nothing we can do, I think is unacceptable. And then the final one is that the Australian content transitional arrangements are unreasonable. And there was an opinion piece in one of the papers saying they were arbitrary. Let me outline both sides of this argument to try and be very fair. The free-to-air TV lobby are opposed to any additional Australian content obligations, not surprisingly, and their argument is we spend $1.2 billion a year on Australian content, more than we've ever done before, and it's better quality than we've ever done before. The first two are matters of fact, the third one's a matter of subjectivity. I actually agree. I think, adult drama in particular, from my viewing history, is probably an all-time high in Australia, but and an absolute amount, 1.2 billion, more than before, very high quality. However, many submissions to our review, including one from the Communications Law Centre, said that with the advent of the extra digital multi-channels, so channels 7, 9 and 10 went from having one station to having 3, that there was a significant dilution of Australian content. Now, what happened in fact was, with the one exception of channel 10 moving Neighbours to channel 11, what happened when the free-to-air networks were not subject to obligations on channel 2 and 3, their second and third channel, they showed no Australian content, zippo, other than the one exception that I talked about. So I tried to, think of an analogy for this, and I guess it's the Australian content, or the Australian industry campaigner, Dick Smith, and I saw him on the news a couple of weeks ago pushing Australian beetroot. And if you use the analogy that I'm sure Dick Smith would probably use, that, there were 6 cans of high quality Australian product on our shelves before. There are 6 cans now. So in an absolute term, that's correct. But the shelf space has tripled. There's been a huge increase in the shelf space. And there has been a dilution where Australian product has been swamped by cheaper imports. So in response to that, we proposed a very targeted and a very specific increase. It sounds like a lot. We said a 50% increase in the sub-quota to Australian drama, to Australian documentaries and to Australian children's. But let me put that in perspective. The total cost of that increase to all 3 networks per annum is $40 million, modelled at $40 million. On a $1.2 billion spend, $40 million is a 3% increase. For that 3% increase, we've recommended doubling the tax break that they get for qualifying Australian content for 20 to 40%. We've recommended giving them flexibility in meeting the obligations that is worth real money to the networks. One of the things they told us loud and clear, they really dislike putting children's television on the main channel because it's very hard to monetise. By definition, it's a narrow audience, and then there's all sorts of advertising restrictions on children's. So they'd love to be able to move children's, and they should be able to do it once most of us have access to digital television. They'd love to make a destination for children's television on the second or third channel and then monetise the mainline channel. It's worth money to them. There's no reason why you wouldn't allow them to do that. And then the third thing is, we think there is the opportunity for the networks to have a discussion with the government about transitional spectrum pricing. So you add all that up, and I believe that there are the tools there for both the Australian production sector to get a little boost in some specific and needed areas, but it'd be done in a way that is not a significant financial burden on the free-to-air networks. So, in conclusion, there remains a clear public interest in maintaining diversity of ownership, minimum content standards and Australian content here. We've proposed a framework, and this is where I connect with Michael's introductory comments. We've proposed a framework, and it is a principles-based framework that is technology neutral and has a chance to last 20 years, which the existing Act has had to do. It's a very difficult thing to try and predict, but by doing it in a principle-based framework way, rather than black letter rules that'll be out of date the day they're enacted, we think we've got a chance of that. We think that covering the top end of professional media is enough. We're abolishing a whole bunch of rules. I actually didn't go through them all, but there's plenty, and you can see them in the report. Give industry news standards, and then finally, probably the question we get asked most in the week since the review, since the report was published, was what do you think the government will do? The fact is we don't know. We've done our job and handed our report to the government. But the thing that gives me some confidence that we haven't wasted a year of our life, I don't think the government are going to take our 198 pages, cut and paste it into law. I do think this will be a lightning rod for the next phase of a debate. But I am convinced there is no option but to act. If you believe diversity of ownership is important, if you believe that community standards are important, and if you believe that Australian content is important, there is no option but to act, because those things will be progressively eroded without that happening. And then finally, I really do invite you. We've tried to make the report approachable. There's a 25-ish page executive summary, then 175 pages that follow. The URL is at the bottom of that chart. I encourage you to have a read of it. Thank you very much.